Welcome to the deep dive. So today we're tackling something really important, how we understand autism. Our guide is this essay by Dr. Jaime Hoerricks called Not an Answer, Just a Trace.
Yeah, and it's a really powerful piece. It's personal reflection, but it digs deep into autism diagnosis,
Yeah.
the problems with misdiagnosis sometimes and these functioning labels. And it really gets into the systemic issues autistic individuals face.
Right. So for you listening, someone who wants to get a grip on complex stuff pretty quickly, this deep dive should offer a really fresh perspective on neurodiversity. We're going to unpack some core ideas, maybe challenge some common thoughts.
Exactly. And the central thing, Horace's main argument, as we'll see through their experiences, is that autism isn't some kind of personal flaw. It's more like a signal, maybe, that our society, our systems, they aren't really built to include neurodivergent ways of being.
Okay, so let's jump right in. One of the first big things the essay hits on is this idea of the, quote, high-functioning autistic person.
Right. Hoerricks, who has a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, level 2, meaning, significant challenges, needs substantial support day to day. They talk about how, despite needing that support, their ability to, say, write very well or present professionally can mask what's really going on.
It paints a misleading picture. Like, competence in one area makes people assume everything's okay.
Precisely. And they bring up this really vivid image from Neuroclastic. It's a meme, actually. It shows an autistic person looking fine, above the
Oh,
surface.
I think I know the one. Underneath, there's all this scaffolding, like holding everything up.
That's it. All the hidden work, managing panic, dealing with overstimulation, just pure exhaustion sometimes, all just to maintain that outward appearance.
Wow. Yeah, that makes you really stop and think about the unseen effort involved.
It really does. And Horrocks sees their own life in that. It underlines this point. We often mistake that outward competence for actual well-being. We totally miss the often immense underlying challenges and the support that's genuinely needed just for survival.
And this leads to something Horrocks calls, I think, low visibility of collapse.
Yeah, exactly. It means that because the struggle isn't always obvious, it forces masking in public, which then often leads to, burnout or breakdown happening in private, unseen.
So the system isn't seeing the real picture.
Because the systems, schools, workplaces, social stuff, they just weren't designed with autistic people in mind, fundamentally. They weren't built to handle, say, nonlinear processing or complex sensory needs, or maybe a need for clearer communication or just a gentler pace sometimes. Neurotypical was the default.
Which brings us right back to those functioning labels. Herrick's really argues they're not just unhelpful, but actually damaging.
Yeah, they don't just simplify, they distort. Because they use what you see the output as a proxy for what's going on inside. And that, as Herricks explains, is incredibly misleading. Someone gets labeled high functioning because maybe they have a job.
Right, or they can talk easily.
Exactly. But that label totally ignores the huge internal effort it might take. And worse, it can make autistic people doubt themselves. They start thinking, well, if I'm high functioning, why is this basic thing so incredibly hard for me? It's like gaslighting yourself.
Yeah, Horrocks shares that exact experience, right?
Yeah.
Being told they're articulate, impressive, while inside they're just falling apart. It creates this awful disconnect. You start questioning your own reality. Am I just lazy? Am I making this up?
Exactly. Because the external feedback just doesn't match the internal truth. The system often only recognizes struggle if it looks a certain way. And Horrocks then looks back at an older article, one by Hogenkamp from 2009. And while it was trying to take a systems view, Horrocks points out it still kind of framed autistic individuals in terms of deficits, like admiring their productivity, sure, but still seeing them as maybe fragile or emotionally dysregulated, needing careful management. Productivity was still the main measure of worth.
That's subtle but important. Even trying to look broader can still trap you in old ways of thinking. And Horrocks goes even further back, critiquing Kanner's original work on autism.
Yes, highlighting the problematic history there, connections to eugenics, that whole refrigerator mother blame thing. It started from a place of assuming brokenness.
But Kanner wasn't the only one back then, was he?
No, and this is crucial. Hoerricks brings up Dr. Grunya Sukareva, whose work is often overlooked. She was researching autism around the same time, but her focus was totally different, much more on integration, support, acceptance, a world away from Kanner's deficit model.
So that deficit view wasn't inevitable. It just won out historically.
It seems so, unfortunately. And Hoerricks argues this leads directly to this damaging binary we still see today. This idea that autistic people have to be either broken or brilliant, a liability or a legacy, elite or gifted.
Like you can only be accepted if you're some kind of savant to make up for the difficulties.
Pretty much. It forces people into justifying their existence through exceptionalism rather than just being accepted as they are. And these background models, even if we don't think about them consciously, they shape everything. How society responds, what needs get dismissed, especially non-visible needs. It just erases the complexity of lived autistic experience.
Okay, so we're seeing this pattern.
Hmm.
Individual experiences get misinterpreted, labels cause harm. Let's talk about how Hoerricks shifts focus, seeing this not just as personal struggle, but as reflecting something bigger, systemic problems.
Right. This is a huge turning point in the essay. That realization that it's not just me, it's the system. Hoerricks uses that powerful phrase, a systemic design flaw disguised as individual inadequacy.
Wow. That really reframes everything.
It does. It shifts the question entirely,
Right.
away from what causes autism, which often implies looking for a defect in the person, to something more like what kind of world creates distress for autistic people. An ecological question, really.
And this connects to later work by Hogenkamp too, right? The evolutionary stress framework.
Yes, the ESF, which is an interesting evolution in thinking itself. Instead of seeing autistic traits purely as symptoms of a disorder, the ESF suggests they might be understandable responses to environmental stress and unpredictability.
So less about a medical problem, more about a reaction to the environment.
Kind of. It starts treating things like sensory sensitivities not just as quirks, but maybe as signals. Signals that the environment is overwhelming or threatening in some way. And this fits perfectly with that core idea of no place for autism. The idea that the problem isn't autism itself, but the lack of environments that actually support autistic ways of being.
Yeah, you think about standard classrooms or typical office environment, even healthcare settings. So often they prioritize speed, constant social interaction, conforming to neurotypical norms.
Exactly. And if you operate differently, the environment itself becomes a source of stress. Hoerricks is really clear on this. Autistic distress isn't just part of being autistic. It's often a direct, logical response to environments that feel chaotic, overwhelming, or just constantly invalidating. It's not that the person is too sensitive or too rigid. It's that the system is too demanding, too inflexible.
Okay, so we see the mismatch. Now, Hoerricks goes deeper, right, into why these systems fail. This is where the power threat meaning framework comes in. PTMF.
Yes, the PTMF. And it's a really different lens compared to, say, the DSM. Instead of starting with a diagnosis, what's wrong with this person, it asks different questions like, what's happened to you? What threats have you faced or are you facing? How did you learn to respond to survive those threats? And what meaning have you made of it all?
So it shifts the focus from inside the person to their external reality and their responses to it.
Completely. And applying that to autism is, it's pretty profound. It suggests that many behaviors we label as autistic symptoms might actually be deeply ingrained patterns of response, ways of coping learned in a world that often feels unsafe, confusing, or like you don't belong.
So it's not about faulty wiring necessarily, but about reacting to the world.
It puts that possibility front and center. And Hoerricks expresses this real frustration with how much scientific research focuses purely on the biological. Neurotransmitters, metabolic markers, all potentially relevant, sure, but often completely ignoring the systemic sources of chronic stress.
Like focusing on the smoke detector going off without checking if the house is on fire.
That's a great analogy, yeah. Hoerricks points back to that 2009 Hogenkamp article again, noting how it talks a lot about the amygdala, dopamine, stress hormones, but very little about the concrete realities, the schools, the workplaces, the social pressures that cause the stress response to be constantly activated.
It's like saying someone has an overactive stress response, but ignoring the fact you're constantly being poked with a stick.
Exactly. What does vulnerable to dysfunction even mean when the systems you have to interact with are themselves dysfunctional or harmful? It reframes those so-called vulnerabilities as understandable reactions.
And the examples are everywhere, aren't they? Standardized tests that penalize different thinking styles, medical systems where you have to perform normal communication to get help, workplaces valuing social ease above all else, rigid social rules.
And Hoerricks argues these aren't bugs in the system, they're often features. They maintain a certain kind of order that benefits the dominant neurotype. And so autistic individuals learn to adapt. They learn to mask, to perform, to try and fit in. Not out of choice, necessarily, but for survival. It's a strategy developed within systems that weren't built for them.
This leads into a really interesting part where Hoerricks talks about their own process of understanding. Not academic research, but lived experience.
Yeah, this lived pattern. It's described as a 5-part thing almost. It starts with a feeling, a sense that something is wrong, something's off. Then comes the self-doubt. Is it me? Am I the problem? Then, crucially, reaching out, connecting with others who have similar feelings or experiences, which helps identify the bigger pattern, seeing it's not just personal, it's systemic. And finally, writing as a way to process it, make sense of it, and build support and understanding.
And the point is that this is a valid form of research, right? This embodied knowledge.
Absolutely. It's presented as just as legitimate, maybe even more grounded sometimes than traditional academic approaches. It offers insights that purely external observation might miss entirely.
Which then raises that huge question Hoerricks poses. What if our systems actually used a process like that? Imagine schools or workplaces actually stopping to recognize harm, sitting with the uncertainty instead of rushing to fix.
Seeking out those affected, really listening to understand the pattern, and then co-creating solutions from that shared understanding. It's radically different.
Yeah. It suggests treating autistic experience not as a problem to solve, but as valuable feedback, like a warning system maybe, for societal structures that have become too rigid, too unsustainable for lots of people, not just autistic folks.
That's exactly it. It connects back to No Place for Autism and the work Hoerricks does with the outside and critical autism studies. The goal isn't fixing autistic people to fit the world, it's changing the world to create genuinely inclusive spaces.
So ultimately, the essay suggests autism isn't a failure, but maybe a kind of compass, helping us see where our culture might be prioritizing things that aren't actually sustainable or humane.
That's the powerful final idea, I think, a compass for a culture that maybe lost its way a bit. So just to kind of pull it all together for everyone listening, this essay really makes a strong case. Autistic individuals aren't broken. Their experiences are actually evidence, highlighting where our systems have significant flaws when it comes to inclusion and support.
And grasping that really shifts the conversation around neurodiversity, doesn't it? It moves the focus from individual deficit towards societal responsibility, the need to build better, more accommodating environments for everyone.
Definitely. And it's important, too, as Hoerricks does, to acknowledge the complexity here. It's not simple. Their nod to Laurie Hogenkamp's evolving ideas shows that right. Understanding grows, perspectives change, dialogue is key.
Yeah. This essay feels like a contribution to keep that dialogue moving, rooted in lived experience, trying to amplify voices that often get pushed to the margins in these big discussions about neurodiversity.
So maybe the thought to leave everyone with as we wrap up this deep dive is this. Just take a moment to consider the systems you interact with, work, community, healthcare, whatever. How might they, even unintentionally, be creating barriers or stress for people who experience the world differently? And what's one small shift in perspective, maybe even just in how we listen or what we prioritize, that could nudge things towards being a bit more inclusive, a bit more sustainable for all of us?